Mr. Ghosh, welcome. It's an honour to have you on our programme. Now, one of your books is called The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, and in it, to understand the climate crisis we are in today, you write, we need to go back in time to the Banda Islands in 1621. Can you tell me what happened there exactly that has influence today?
Sure. Well, what happened is that, the Banda Islands were the only islands in the world that actually had this tree, the nutmeg tree. And it's a very extraordinary thing because it's a tiny archipelago. You can hardly even see it on a map, but they had this amazing tree which made the islands rich and prosperous. They were great traders. They traded across the Indian Ocean. They were visited by Arabs and Chinese and so on. So immediately after entering the Indian Ocean, the early European navigators, they were determined to find the Banda Islands, all of Maluku, because they were the spice islands and spices were very important commodities. So the Portuguese were the first to reach the Banda Islands. That was around 1512, I think. They just traded a little bit, didn't do very much else. The Dutch reached the Banda Islands in 1600. And their plan was immediately to impose a monopoly on the Banda Islanders, a monopoly on the nutmeg and mace trades. But the islanders resisted. I mean, of course they would resist.
They would have, yes.
So in 1621, Jan Pietersen Koen, who was then the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, he decided to implement a final solution. So he took a fleet. In February 1621, he took this fleet to the Banda Islands. And basically by April that year, they had completely exterminated the local population. They killed about a third of them. They drove about a third of them into the mountains where they perished of starvation and disease and so on. And they enslaved about a third of them. So these islands were completely depopulated. And then what the VOC did was that they divided up the islands into what they call perken, plantations. Yeah. And they brought in Dutch-descended perkeneers and handed over the perken to them. And then the VOC agreed to provide them with slaves. So for the next 2 centuries, actually, the Dutch Empire provided these islanders with slaves. Most of the slaves actually came from South Asia.
And how does that bloodbath have an influence on what we see today with climate change? How are those two things connected?
Well, I think the basic connection is through extractivism. Because the Bandanese had this amazing tree. It was their tree of life. It had sustained them for millennia. And then suddenly, one day, it became their tree of death. Their whole world essentially came to an end. Yeah. Because they had this tree, because they had this amazing resource. And then, so they were the first victims of what we now call the resource curse. Yeah. But, the resource curse over the subsequent years has really afflicted the whole world. Yeah. In Amazonia, it was rubber. In the Congo, again, it was rubber. I mean, literally millions of people killed in order to extract a resource.
These were two conflicting worldviews. The earth as a resource and the earth as something that's been given to you, that's right. Basically.
That's right.
Now, you grew up in India, so how has that shaped your view on this matter?
I think I'm old enough and I grew up at a time when we preserved some semblance of the older ways of thinking about the earth. I mean, I was brought up to feel that you always have to tread very lightly on the earth and, use as little as possible, be very sparing in your use of things and so on, never waste. All of that is now gone. Yeah. Even within India. This is the saddest part of it, that countries like India and Indonesia, which were maybe victims of this extractivism, they are now going through a process of what you might call auto-colonization. Where they're
doing it themselves, you mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is exactly what is happening. Certainly in India, very much so in Indonesia. As you know, these vast forests are being cut down in order to basically grow palm oil.
Yeah.
In India, you know, the lands of indigenous peoples in the forests are being taken away in order to open them up for mining.
Well, you have a word for that in the book. In your work, you write about terraforming.
Yes.
And I read that, and I obviously, as a Dutch person, thought about the polders, which is effectively a Dutch tradition, draining water from land to make it livable. What is wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that as such. It's not a bad thing as such. See, the Dutch grew up, I mean, over millennia in this particular landscape. So they co-evolved with it. They learned, you know, to do it in a certain way. But where this becomes really problematic is when you try to implement those solutions in ecosystems that are completely different.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm from Bengal. We have this, you know, Bengal is an estuarine region. So, you know, since the 40s and 50s, 60s, the World Bank and other international agencies have tried to apply the Dutch model to the Sundarbans, you know, to the mangrove forest and to this, the estuarine regions of Bengal, where they've tried to create these polders and these embankments. Often it's Dutch experts who go there and advise them. The problem is that the Rhine receives 1% of the silt that goes into the Ganges-Brahmaputra system. The Ganges-Brahmaputra system carries something like 45% of the world's silt. So you can't apply a solution that's taken up, you know, in a relatively gentle landscape like this, and try and apply it to an incredibly biologically active region like Bengal. Yeah. And it's proved to be a disaster. You know, the people's indigenous ways of managing the land was actually much better, simply because they knew that land.
They knew the land.
Yeah.
So it's not the terraforming itself, it's the fact that it's not being applied with knowledge of the place that it's being applied to.
Well, you know, the thing about terraforming, the reason why it's so interesting is because it's not all kinds of interventions in ecosystems, because human beings have always intervened in their ecosystems. Yeah. As we know, there's no such thing as a pristine forest or whatever. The Amazon was home to more than 10 million people, as we now know. There were huge civilizations there. And the Amazon co-evolved with human beings. But what's different is that, you know, when you're indigenous to a place and you learn that landscape, you learn to live with that landscape over a very long time. What you do to that landscape is also a part of that landscape. The landscape teaches you what to do to it. Yeah. What happened when the Dutch and British colonists went to to North America, or to the Banda Islands in the 17th century, is that they were presented with a landscape they did not know, and they hated it. Yeah. They hated the swamps, they hated the forests. So they immediately set about cutting it down.
It wasn't productive, it wasn't efficient. Yes.
Their idea was to make that landscape look like Europe.
And I thought it was so fascinating because you named the Dutch colonists and the English colonists, and you know our history so well. Yet in 2 days, you're being handed an award by the Dutch king, whose family plays quite a big role in the Netherlands, obviously. Is that in any way uncomfortable, or do you find it remarkable?
I do find it remarkable, actually, because it is really true that, Holland, there were pioneers in colonization. They did many terrible things in their colonial history. But also, it's very important to remember that the Dutch were the first of the European imperial states to develop a critical tradition in relation to imperialism. You know, Multatuli was very much a pioneer and an outlier. And for example, even the material that we have on the Banda genocide was really preserved by a Dutch archivist called Van der Kuys.
That's a paradox, isn't it?
It's a great paradox. Yeah. But it's a very distinguished tradition that the Dutch have, of both being imperialists, but also being critics of empire. I mean, Couperus, I think, was one of the great most imaginative critics of empire, if you like. But again, I mean, that tradition has lasted until modern times.
Yeah.
You know, Queen Wilhelmina in 1900 actually issued an apology to the people of Java. Can you imagine Queen Victoria doing that? It's absolutely unimaginable.
Yeah, so it's both.
So, yeah, it's both. It's, you know, there's an ambiguity within that tradition which I think needs to be recognized.
Yeah.
So, for example, even with Jan Pietersen Cohen, I mean, you know, movements to remove his statue started in Holland going back 20, 30 years.
Yeah, so that's quite a
new.
long tradition. Can we just briefly go to today, because this weekend we saw a very troublesome end of a climate conference. The poorer countries had left the summit at some point, stating that the richer countries should give more money, and even the Panama climate representative said it's as if the developed world wants the planet to burn. Do you think he has a point?
Look, I hate to say this, because I really feel for the activists who are there, and I don't want to say anything to make them feel that their work is not valuable. Mm. But at the same time, what he said has been clear to all of us. I mean, certainly been clear to me for a very long time.
But you could also argue that $300 billion is quite a lot of money, so...
Compared to the loss and damages that we are actually facing today, it's really nothing. I mean, what they wanted was 1.3 trillion.
Yes.
You know, and look, during the Paris Agreement, the West promised $100 billion. They didn't actually pay even a tenth of it. Oh, we don't have money, we don't have money. But suddenly, as you will have seen, suddenly the German Chancellor declares, he says, oh, we may not have armaments, but we have lots of money. So we can just spend on armaments, you know, and how much of this, they've boosted their armament spending to something close to 1 trillion.
So you say the West is willing to give money to weapons, but not to climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely wrong to think, as I said in my book, The Nutmeg's Curse, it's an error to think that the West isn't preparing for climate change. Only they're not preparing by mitigating emissions. The way in which they're preparing is they're preparing for war. They see this, they see climate change essentially as a conflict.
Is that why because you don't call it a climate crisis, you call it a planetary crisis?
Yeah, I don't...
Is that why that is? Because everything, in your view, is connected?
Absolutely.
How?
Well, look, it's like this. We have multiple crises unfolding simultaneously. Biodiversity loss, that's perhaps even more important than the climate crisis. We have these new pandemics, we have AI. There are so many different vectors of this crisis. I think to single out climate change as the singular driver of the crises that's happening in the world, it's actually to distort the field, because the climate crisis, like the biodiversity crisis, these are both effects of a general crisis of acceleration that's been happening in the world, since 1950, but which increased tremendously after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Washington Consensus emerging in 1990, which basically said, let's turn the whole world into mass consumerists. So you have this incredible acceleration, and it's this acceleration that's behind all these crises. You know, so the crises are connected through a crisis of acceleration, if you like.
I just want to, I don't know if I have time, but I heard you say in a podcast, because normally I'd ask, but Mr. Ghosh, where's the hope for us to do anything? And I heard you say in a podcast that asking for hope is quite a Western thing to do.
Yes.
So what does that leave me?
See, this hope and despair binary comes entirely out of a kind of mindset which created the problem in the first place, which is there must be progress, there must be a never-ending growth, and this and that. Now we know that we are heading for very severe disruption, you know. I mean, it's basically a matter of trying to prevent the worst outcomes. But we know.
We just need to do something because we need to do something.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a question of duty. It's not a question of hope.
A question of duty and not a question of hope. Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Micah. Thank you very much.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit nou een goed gesprek? Vergeet je dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een comment achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Oh ja, dit gebeurde er de vorige keer.
De wolf is echt een voorbeeld in die cultuuroorlog geworden. Dus ik zou ervoor pleiten, een klein beetje gezond verstand, laat de wetenschap zijn werk doen en zijn blij dat die dieren terugkomen.